We're going to focus on case studies in this particular session. And then we're going to have another session next week, right? About grounded theory with a particular focus on what is called the Joya methodology, like a step-by-step guide about how to apply this. I will take the liberty myself of illustrating Dennis Joya's way of doing grounded theory in a very practical, concrete way. And it will also be an opportunity to reflect more generally about the usefulness, but also the pitfalls of using templates. So before I start, some disclaimers. Disclaimer number one. What I'm going to do is I will not present, what I want to present is not the only way or even the best way to analyze qualitative data. There are many ways to analyze qualitative data. This is what has worked for me in the past. This is not an introduction to qualitative research or a more general discussion of the various ways in which you can analyze qualitative data. This is focused on what I think I have learned in the last few years in doing case studies and grounded theory. So not everyone will agree with the approach that I'm presenting. Some people will think that this is not the best way or not even the right way of doing qualitative research. This is what has worked for me. Yes. This is what has worked for me in certain journals. It may not work in other journals. There may be other journals, equally good journals, that may be less receptive with this way of doing research. And there's a continuous debate going on about the right way or the appropriate ways of doing qualitative research. And so what got you published 20 years ago may not get you published today, and vice versa. Disclaimer number three, as I already said, I will focus on case studies and next week grounded theory, not because I think these are the best or the most appropriate methods, but this is because they're the ones that I know best. And what I'm going to do today, I'm going to, again, share something about what I think I have learned. And then finally, I'm sure that some people will question on epistemological, ontological grounds some of my statements, some of the things I do. And I apologize in advance. I am not a methodologist. I see myself more as a craftsman. I try to use various available techniques, maybe combining them, modifying them, trying to come up with whatever is needed given the particular research design to produce explanations that are the most plausible for what I see, given the evidence that I managed to gather. So that's what I'm always trying to do. Keeping in mind some fundamental methodological, ontological, epistemological premises, but with a relatively pragmatic, if not pragmatist, focus. So what I'm going to do today, first, I'm going to show you how I approach case studies, and in particular, how I think my ways of theorizing from case studies work. This is not something that I do consciously. This is more something that I think I do based on a retrospective reflection, asking myself, how do I come up with this interpretation? Like, how do I manage to go from this mass of qualitative data to these theoretical ideas, to a theoretical model? How did it happen? And I will try to share with you some reflections about how I think this stuff happens. That may also be important in terms of explaining your readers and your reviewers how it happened in your case. I will then focus on the use of visuals with a particular focus on using visuals like tables and figures to support your theorizing. There are many ways in which you could use tables and figures, and today, and they would deserve probably a webinar in itself, today we will focus on how I use this visual support to help me move from data to theory. And finally, in the conclusion, I will say a few words on what I think are the right attitudes, the right mindset, right practices that you should follow when doing case studies and qualitative research more generally. And what I'm going to do, I will then, of course, you feel free to interrupt me anytime. But otherwise, at the end of each section, I will leave some room for questions. Maybe I'm not monitoring the chat because otherwise I would just get distracted. But maybe once we have these natural breaks, we can also take some time for questions or addressing the chat. Okay, so building theories with case studies. What is a case study, first of all? Well, if you believe Yin, which is considered the fundamental reference, methodological reference for case studies, or one of the main fundamental references, Yin defines case studies as a study that investigates a contemporary phenomenon within its real-life context, as opposed to experimental work, for instance, especially when the boundaries between the phenomenon and the context are not clearly evident. I mean, when you need an open, relatively flexible methodology that allows you to collect data both about the phenomenon and the context itself. And more specifically, it relies on multiple sources of evidence. Interviews, observation, archival data, even quantitative evidence, not count the countables, used to say Tom Lee, with data that need to converge in a triangulation fashion, meaning you need multiple sources of data to support your theoretical statements, your theoretical conclusions. And this, I think, to me, is the essence of case study. If you think about it, case study in qualitative research is more or less a residual category. So whenever your study is not a clear ethnography or a clear grounded theory, it is probably a case study. Or at least, and as long as it relies on multiple sources of data, it's qualitative, it's real-life context, you can call it a case study. It's a relatively loose category. And if you think about it, some people may even argue that everything we do is really a case study because we are studying a phenomenon in a particular setting at a particular point in time, in a particular industry or organization, even if we use other more specific methodologies. Now, when it comes to case studies, there are a lot of excellent sources on case study research. There's Yin, and there's a very interesting article written by Andrew Pettigrew long ago, various books, Katin Eisenhardt's articles, widely cited, widely used, and even more recent stuff. And really, if you're interested in learning more about case studies, please go and look at this work. And this is not the only relevant literature, but this is perhaps the most widely studied, cited, or perhaps what I found more interesting personally. Now, the problem with this, and I'm not going through there's a lot of wise suggestions, practical guidance. I'm not repeating what they say in these books, in these articles. This is not a case study 101, okay? I will focus on analysis, of data analysis, because the thing is that if we, with the exception of Eisenhardt, that gives us some very detailed guidance for comparative case studies, we don't know much about how to actually, what to do with data in case studies. Eisenhardt's template is great, but it works for a particular type of case studies. It's a multiple case study, and it's based on polar cases, when you have, for instance, very fast decision makers and very slow decision makers, and you're trying to understand what variables influence this particular variance in one construct, in the speed of decision making. But what to do when you have a multiple case study that is not looking for variance, but is looking for commonalities, for instance, is searching for robust support for a common theoretical framework? Or what to do with single case studies, that is less clear. I mean, at least I haven't found very clear guidance about what you're supposed to do. Most sources either tell you a lot about how to sample, collect data, or how to present data to be persuasive, or, case of Yin, offer some general principles, find a chain of evidence, pattern matching, but the actual guidance, well, you're kind of left alone with this massive body of data that you have collected. Now, the closest I got to some clear step-by-step guidance was in Miles and Huberman, the original 1984 book about analyzing qualitative data. And Miles and Huberman, they tell you that qualitative data analysis is essentially based on 4 steps. Step 1, data reduction. Qualitative data analysis usually is based on a massive amount of data. You have dozens of interviews, you have hundreds of pages, you have hours and hours of observation, videos, you name it. First step, figure out what is relevant and what is less relevant. You may have heard a lot of things, collected a lot of documents. Not all of this stuff is relevant. Focus, reduce, make it manageable. Second step, organize some assemblies. Miles and Huberman are very keen on the importance of matrices, graphs, tables, visuals. Probably that's why I really like Miles and Huberman, because that's the step that, according to them, will help you see some regularities, some patterns, some sequences, some similarities, some differences. And then, as you notice that, thanks to this data display, you start developing some theoretical explanations. And then you wonder, like, okay, how do I do that? Well, we get to that later. And once you have some tentative theoretical explanations, then you go back and test them with a more systematic investigation of your database or collecting additional data. And this is pretty much what I do. Even though I realize that my way of approaching case studies is a little less linear, is a little messier than this, with phases that are less clearly separated from one another. I came to the conclusion that the way it really works for me, and I presume it works for a lot of people, is that first, you really immerse yourself in the setting. It means that you read everything you can possibly read that's relevant, internal documents, external communication, press releases, press articles, interview all the people that are knowledgeable about whatever you're interested in. Like, try to learn as much as you can about a particular phenomenon in the particular context in which the phenomenon is unfolding. And as you do this, your brain will inevitably start developing some tentative explanations, because this is what our brain does. Our brain is designed to notice patterns, to notice things moving together, to notice similarities, to notice differences, and to come up with some possible explanation. And maybe you already hear some possible explanations from some of your informants. And this will almost inevitably start developing some intuitive, maybe an intuitive representation of a process model, or intuitive propositions about what is linked to what. But this is still intuitive in a sense that it's based on a relatively holistic engagement with your data. Now, our brain that is in the background processing all the stuff that we have heard and connecting the dots and then proposing some possible interpretation of what's going on. But the problem is that our brain is not only designed to notice patterns. Our brain is only designed to pay more attention to some things, not because they're more important than others, but because they are more colorful, they're louder, or for whatever reason. And so it may be that we overstate the importance of some data, piece of data, at the expense of others. And I will give you an example. Later on, I will tell you about a study of robotic surgery and the diffusion of robotic surgery in Italy. And my colleagues who had done all the data collection had come up with an early interpretation that was very focused on the material engagement with the technology, with the emotional excitement of interacting with the technology. And that was because some of the surgeons that they had interviewed, they had very colorful expressions. Would say, oh, the robot is cool, it's like a video game, the robot is better than sex. It's like, whoa, that's what catches the attention. No? And that's what they say, wow, that's very important. But then when I joined them, I said, look, this is very cool, but let's try to have a more systematic analysis. And once we do a more systematic analysis of what drives adoption, and I will show you some later, you will see that this explained very little in the very beginning, but the story was really a story of social positioning, not a story of material engagement. But then again, this was probably something that our brain would consider more boring, not as exciting as this other piece of data. And so the intuitive interpretation was somehow overlooking some important parts. So the next step is, once you have these intuitive interpretations, then plunging back in the data more consciously, more systematically, possibly collecting additional data and trying to see if your data really support or reject some interpretations. Sometimes these interpretations are based on some informant saying, this is what happened. And you think, oh, that's a reasonable explanation of what happened. Then you go and find some data to corroborate, and you realize that actually their impression was wrong. Their interpretation was wrong. And if I simply take their interpretation as a plausible explanation because, hey, they know best, without checking, without searching for corroboration, I would have come up with an incorrect interpretation of the particular phenomenon. You will see that there's a line in gray. I'm talking about retroduction, retroductive development. We'll get to that later. That's let's just use the study of robotic surgery to give you an idea of how this works, or at least how this worked in this particular study. This is a study that was published in AMJ back in 2015, and it tracked the diffusion of robotic surgery from the very first hospital that tentatively adopted and soon abandoned this technology, to ask a question of how innovations diffuse in a very early stage. We have theories about innovation that say, well, innovations diffuse because they work, or innovation diffuse because there's isomorphic pressure, some bandwagoning. But when it's the very beginning, well, we don't know if they work or not. And in this particular case, there was still a lot of uncertainty 10 years later about whether it really worked better than laparoscopy, for instance, and whether the additional benefits were worth the enormous investment in robotic surgery. And yet, in the absence of pressure in the beginning and in the presence of uncertainty, this technology diffused. Why was that? And my colleagues, Amelia Compagni and Valentina Mele, had done an incredible job in interviewing every surgeons, every manager that had been involved in the first 47, 48 adoption decisions in 43 different hospitals. If they were still alive at the time of data collection, they talked to them. And then collecting a lot of other documentary evidence and archival evidence. Now, obviously, analyzing all this data was not easy. It wasn't easy to come up with a pre-planned design. It was really a matter of developing some intuitive explanations and then testing them against additional data. And the initial intuitive explanation, diffusion is driven by the excitement with the technology. Once tested against the data in a more systematic way, so, well, actually, no, that doesn't quite explain much of what happened. In the paper, to give you an example of what happened later, we made some statements, and reviewers wanted evidence of these statements. So one of the most important statements we've made is like, in a very early phase of diffusion of a new practice or new technology, peripheral actors will adopt in the field, in this case, the field of medicine in Italy, or surgery, will adopt the practice driven by the search for strategic benefits. Central actors will do so driven by a reputational imperative, meaning peripheral actors wanted to adopt this strategically to become the masters of the new technology and become central, become prominent, become influential. Those that were influential, they try it out to be consistent with their own reputation of the master of the current technology. But the questions of the reviewers were like, but how do you know what motivated adoption in the first place? And how do you know who is central and who is peripheral in the field? It's like, well, good question. Actually, the motivations we know about the motivations because we open-coded all these 100 and plus interviews in which surgeons and managers explained why they decided to make this considerable investment in a technology that was still in the early days of its development. And this is an example. This is just an excerpt from a table that was much, much bigger, that had many more quotes for each code. This is the typical Joya methodology that we'll discuss next week, or grounded theory, more generally, if you will. We heard things like, we had to maintain a reputation for being cutting edge for cardiac surgery. The robot served the purpose. We labeled it with a descriptive code, well, coherence with reputation for technological leadership. Then other people said, with the robot, the top manager wanted to be under the spotlight, search for organizational visibility. And then we coded these relatively descriptive, we grouped these relatively descriptive labels in broader, more analytical, more theoretical codes. So coherence with reputation for technological leadership and coherence with reputation of lead surgeon, the more general code, reputational imperative, understood as the need to maintain consistency with the reputation for the organization or the person. Search for organizational visibility, building reputation for technological leadership, using technology as a marketing tool, group together, search for social gains. And I'm already introducing something here that we'll return to next week, because I think this is important when doing this when analyzing data in this way, the Joya methodology or grounded theory more generally. Your first order codes must be descriptive. They should be formulated in a way that they are easily understandable for your informants. This is how you describe your data in terms of your informant's interpretation. The second order codes, you're moving away from description to analysis. The second order codes have to be theoretical. This is the language of academia, of science, search for social gains. Yeah, I still kind of grasp what it means, but building reputation for technological leadership, using technology as a marketing tool, this is more the language of your informants. Okay, so you see that we actually mixed and matched various techniques, because this is what case studies is about. The case study as a methodology is relatively flexible. Systematically coding all the interviews to identify the possible drivers. And then for each adoption, we labeled, we identified the main motivational drivers as explained by our informants. And then we arranged them in a timeline that showed us visually, relatively clearly, that as time went by, the motivations for adoptions changed. And whether in the beginning it was driven by some kind of internal imperative or the search for social gains, it gradually moved towards imitating the early peripheral actors who succeeded in becoming more visible, and finally feeling the pressure that everybody's adopting the robot, so we have to adopt it too. It's not 100% perfect, but even in correlation in quantitative studies, you never have an R squared that is 100%. You never, in correlation, you never explain 100% of the variance. So this persuaded reviewers that actually there was some variation over time into why hospitals adopted robotic surgery. Now, how did we know who was central and who was peripheral? Well, we know from theory that central actors are usually larger, more prominent. So we, for every single hospital, we tracked number of beds, size at the time of adoption, and whether at the time of adoption they were affiliated with a medical school. And actually, we've noticed that around 800 beds, from 800 beds on, most hospitals were also affiliated with a medical school. And then from 800 beds down, almost no hospitals were affiliated with a medical school. So we thought, well, this seems to like a subjectively, a good heuristic way of finding a threshold and saying from 800 above, central, from 800 below, peripheral. Keep in mind that there were also 900 more hospitals that hadn't adopted the robot. So this threshold wasn't cutting the hospital field in Italy in two. It was cutting it like in a very elite, and then there was the all the rest. Okay, but now this was clearly, there was some degree of subjectivity in cutting this threshold. So we said, well, actually, being central or peripheral is not just a matter of demographic characteristics or objective attributes, but it's also a matter of being of subjective attribution of being prominent or being less relevant. And so we went again through all the interviews, and we tracked whenever our informants were referring to themselves or other hospitals as large, big, influential, prominent, well-known, or relatively obscure, small, peripheral. And then we classified them also based on this additional source of evidence. For instance, hospital number 2, cardiac surgery had high volumes of activity. Many patients from all over Italy came to this hospital because of us. Central. Hospital number 4, we were atypical in the sense that such a small hospital with a medical school normally doesn't have this kind of cutting-edge technology. Peripheral. Now, we were reassured that the classification based on our informants' accounts and the classification based on demographic data were almost perfectly overlapping, with only 3 discrepancies that could be easily explained. For instance, in one case, hospital 5, this was a small hospital, but it was specialized in cardiac surgery. So it didn't have many beds, but that's just because it was all cardiac surgery. So it was actually quite large compared to other cardiac surgeries around the country. And this is really triangulation in action. This is an excellent example of what it means to triangulate, of finding quantitative and qualitative evidence to support a classification, a statement about your data, being peripheral, being central. Reviewers were very happy with this. Other statement, just to give you an idea of how it works. Intensive efforts to disseminate implementation experiences, meaning what they learned from trying out the robot, will constitute some very early adopters as exemplary users, influencing the decisions of later adopters. So the questions here were like, how do we know who influenced whom and how? And how do we distinguish these exemplary users from other users? Now, again, there was an open coding of dissemination efforts. We tracked, we went through all the interviews, trying to track all the various ways in which early adopters tried to share what they had learned about robotic surgery, either by publishing, presenting at conferences, inviting colleagues to attend operations. But on the other hand, we also tracked people that said, I made the decision to adopt a robot after I went to participated to Dr. Giulianotti's operation, or after I read about these studies. So we had not only had people that said, we tried to share our knowledge this way, but also other people that said, actually, that way of sharing knowledge was important to us. So that reassured the reviewers that actually there was transfer there. It wasn't just like some people putting knowledge out there and other people ignoring it. And then for every practice, we created this relational diagram that tracked who was influenced by whom based on their own admissions. And these diagrams showed clearly some hospitals, H4 and H6, that were clearly influencing a lot of later decisions. Now, if we look at, now we then also look at what these, all the evidence we had of public communication of these hospitals. And again, we noticed that H4 and H6 were far more active than any other hospital in publishing, presenting, diffusing videos on YouTube. So they were clearly much more pushing this diffusion much more visibly than anybody else. And they were recognized as leaders, pioneers. Now, again, we went through all the interviews. looking for references to these particular surgeons. And again, it turned out that H4 and H6 were by far the most widely cited surgeons when our informants explained why they had adopted the robot and what did they do before making this decision. So again, multiple sources of evidence supporting some important general statement. Now, almost none of this stuff went into the paper. If you look at the published version, you don't see all of this. This is all something that we enclosed to the response letter. Some of these tables ended up, some of these figures ended up in the paper, but most of them don't. Otherwise, the paper would have been an enormous collection of tables. But reviewers, and then maybe we refer to this in some footnote or in some part of the methods, but they were important to reassure reviewers that our statement were not based just on intuitive extrapolation from some interviews. There were some serious systematic efforts to find multiple converging sources of evidence for the statements we made. Now, the thing is that this is great, but this is not enough yet, because there's one last step that is important. The problem with case studies is that in order to provide a significant theoretical contribution, the theoretical conclusions that you draw, the explanation that you provide, needs to have what Yin calls analytical generalizability. Everything we do is expected to, so whenever we do a case studies, we are not expected to provide an accurate explanation for what happened in that particular case. We're not interested in using existing theories to explain that particular case. We are interested in using a case to learn something more that we can then transfer to other cases, to expand our theoretical understandings. So the explanation that we provide shouldn't be historical. What happened is the consequence of a set of events and circumstances that were very specific and that led to those outcomes. Well, this is how historians work. In order to get published, at least in the journals that I have in mind that I've been working with, you need to provide a theoretical explanation, an explanation in terms of more general mechanisms and theoretical relationships that will apply in other similar circumstances as well. And we can transfer from this specific case to other similar cases. So how do you do that? Well, I came across recently to this idea of retroduction, and don't quote me on this, meaning that I haven't done very much reading, but I thought it, when I found this idea of retroduction, I went like, bam, that's what I do. It's not purely inductive. It's not, certainly not deductive, even abductive. Now, a lot of people now use this abduction as a more realistic way in which we approach qualitative research. In my case, I honestly think it's retroduction. And what is retroduction? Retroduction, Sayer says, it's a mode of inference in which events, so what you observe in your case study, are explained by postulating mechanisms, so more general processes, relationships, interactions in place, which are capable of producing them. So it's trying to explain what you observed, not in descriptive historical terms, but in terms of more fundamental underlying mechanisms in play. It's a plausible explanation, meaning it's the best explanation you can come up with given the available evidence. It's better than any other alternative explanations, to account for the facts that you observe, given some accepted premises. Now, what are these accepted premises? This is very important, because this is the part that nobody tells you about, or nobody, at least nobody I found told me about. Like, how do you produce this theoretical explanation? How do you find these mechanisms? Now, and this is something very new, and I'm really curious to see how you respond, because this is something that I came up with last week, essentially. And thank you, Ibrat, for for pushing me to do this. And I found it very, very interesting. So if you think about it, one very simple way of looking at what we do when we're doing qualitative research is we start with a research question. We don't often, which kind of the research question emerges as we go along. But let's pretend we have a clear research question that leads to some empirical observation, some regularities, some patterns, some similarities, differences, sequences of phases, progressions, co-occurrences. Now, at this stage, this is still descriptive. For all we know, this may be due to a very specific set of circumstances that may not happen again in any other comparable site. But we are expected, if we want to get our stuff published in certain journals, to produce a theoretical account, a non-idiosyncratic explanation, an explanation in more general theoretical terms of these empirical regularities we observed. And this is what we need to do in order to claim analytical generalizability. So how do we do that? Well, we do that, or I do that, at least, by resting this explanation on more general theoretical premises, on what we accept as true, let's say, about how organizations work, about how people think, about how people act, interact, make decisions, more general theories that give us the theoretical infrastructure to build more specific theoretical explanations, more sophisticated, elaborated, specific theoretical explanation. Let me give you some examples, and hopefully we'll go through 3 examples, and hopefully it will be a little clearer, but I will be happy, right after there will be a break for questions. So we'll be happy to hear if this is clear or not. The robotic surgery study. Research question. How do practices diffuse when there is still high uncertainty about their effectiveness? The empirical regularities that we observed, renowned surgeons adopted robotic surgery early and abandoned after early failures. Diffusion was driven by young, ambitious surgeons actively sharing their experience and diffusing even minor success stories. This is what we saw happening. This is a descriptive representation of our empirical observation. And I already showed you how some of the analysis we did in order to come to this conclusion. Now, how do we explain this? Well, we know that actors in a field make choices, like adopting or not adopting robotic surgery, also having in mind how these choices help maintain or improve their social position. We care about our social position within a field, and this is something that we keep in mind when making decisions. And if we accept this, if we accept this as true, as a reasonable representation of how people act, then we can explain the empirical observation in these terms. Practices diffuse in an early stage because peripheral actors that want to become central have an interest in claiming success, while central actors that want to maintain their position have an interest in hiding failure. Which means that there will be an overstatement of how a technology or a practice really work that will encourage other people to adopt it, even if in reality, this technology, there's still a lot of uncertainty. You see how it works. Like we move from an empirical observation to that is still very descriptive to a theoretical account that is more general. It's not referred to robotic surgery. It's a theoretical account that may even explain the diffusion of new methods in academia, for instance. And this is based on a fundamental theoretical assumption about how actors in the field make decisions that may have an impact on their social position. Okay, other example. Study with my former colleague Alessandro Giudici and his supervisor Patrick Reinberger. How do open system orchestrators, like business matchmakers, incubators, these organizations whose job is to orchestrate a dispersed network of entrepreneurial innovation, how do they promote this dispersed entrepreneurial innovation in their network? Well, one of the things that Alessandro and Patrick observe in their study, and I joined later to help them develop these ideas, the B2B matchmaker that they studied provided referrals to participants before the events, meaning they sent them information and say, look, you might be interested in talking to this person. And they carefully arranged the location of stands to encourage the proximity, geographical proximity of participants that they saw may have opportunities to collaborate. And how can we claim that this is what these particular types of actions influence entrepreneurial innovation? How can we claim that this is part of the capabilities that are needed in order to do that? Well, we brought in a theory of entrepreneurship, a fairly established theory of entrepreneurship that says entrepreneurial innovation is based on a novel combination of complementary resources. Information about the resource availability and market needs is dispersed. So there's people having complementary resources, and there's information is dispersed, and networking is one way to get in touch with people that have important information and important resources. Now, if you accept this, then we can explain what we saw in terms of orchestrators promoting dispersed entrepreneurial innovation through activities that increase the likelihood that participants acquire information about potential complementarities leading to new ventures. You see, again, a more general explanation that rests on a more general theory of entrepreneurship. Last example. My work with my friend Charlotte Cloutier from HEC Montréal. How and why do organizational identities change over a long period of time? We studied 4 Canadian nonprofit organizations, and we noticed that nonprofit organizations that define themselves in terms of a cause, we're about environmental sustainability, social justice, had more linear long-term trajectories. Those that define themselves in terms of benefits periodically altered the scope of their activities. They entered into new domains. They had a less linear evolution over time. Now, here, the theoretical premise was, we know from past theories that self-categorization shapes the search and evaluation of growth opportunities. We tend to focus primarily within the boundaries of the category that we see us belonging to. Now, if we accept this as true, then we can explain what we saw in terms of organizations that define themselves in terms of a market category, like the cause, will prioritize opportunities for differentiation within that category. So we stick with this cause and we try to distinguish from others that pursue the same cause. Organizations that define themselves in terms of the needs of a stakeholder group, beneficiaries, will be less constrained by categorical boundaries and focus instead on better serving these needs and therefore straddle various categories and expanding the scope of their activities. Now, I hope these 3 examples help you understand how it works. Because, and if you go and look at the papers that we wrote, you will notice that when theorizing from the case study, first we describe what we saw, and then we move in a section that is in between the findings and the discussion, some grounded, emerging theoretical framework, and say, well, if we accept this theoretical, then we can explain what we saw in these terms. And this is what we do in order to support the analytical generalizability. And say what we saw was not specific to this particular case. It can be explained in broader terms. Now, again, I do this pretty much intuitively, in a sense that I only came to the conclusion that this is what I do last week, pushed by Ibrazzo's offer to do this webinar. But so it's something that really happens as I write down an explanation for this and say, but how can I explain this? And I've tried to put this into advice. I mean, like, what can you do in order to try to do this? And the first thing is it comes way before. You need a solid and varied theoretical foundations. The better you know, the more familiar you are with broader theoretical, broader theories of organizations, of cognition, of innovation, of entrepreneurship, of competition, whatever it's relevant, like you need the theoretical foundations that your brain can draw on and bring them to bear on your analysis. So people are often told that you have to approach qualitative research in a purely inductive way, tabula rasa. You need some theoretical infrastructures that you will build on to develop your theoretical explanations. Then you have to look for general explanations, not site-specific. The purpose is not to explain exactly what happened in terms of the conversations that the person had or whatever, like the very specific incidents. It's like, try to zoom out a little bit, and what are the fundamental mechanisms that seems to be at play here? And then you will have some intuitive explanations, and then ask yourself, okay, if this is the explanation, what is the more general theory here? Like, how can I explain this explanation? If you pardon the... And then, I think this is also very important. Try to apply this emerging explanation to similar cases. Like, okay, now that I have come up with this explanation, can I think of similar cases, and would this apply there? I think this is crucial. It's absolutely crucial. If you go and look at the last few papers I've published, in all of them, somewhere in the discussion, you will find a paragraph or two that says, and by the way, if you look at this prior published work, we can explain this in terms of our model, or we can apply our model to understand better this case and that case and that case. So there's always a way to, an attempt to show reviewers that this is not an explanation. These mechanisms were not at play only in our particular site, but they can be used to illuminate other cases. And if they don't, then you have a problem. If you cannot find any comparable case, or you find a comparable case and things don't go like you would expect them to go based on your model, then you have to ask yourself why. Maybe you haven't considered some important contextual variable. This doesn't mean that your paper, your theoretical explanation needs to be trashed. Maybe there are some important boundary conditions, not contextual conditions that make things go differently because of whatever. And always keep in mind that theorizing means explaining, not describing in abstract terms. Too often, as a reviewer, as an editor, I saw theorizations that were really an empirical descriptions using abstract terms. That's not a theorization. Theorization is an explanation, is an explanation of how all these constructs are linked together that cannot be, they are related in this way because that's what I saw. You need to explain the mechanisms that link these various constructs. Okay. I would stop here, maybe for a pause for a second, because I've talked a lot and we are not even halfway. I don't know how we're doing with timing, but I see Alicia has a hand raised, so please.
Hi, do you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, thank you. I'm a PhD student in Quebec and I'm studying managerial innovation in the public sector. So with the example, I was really captivated. And I'm wondering, because you talked about 4 steps with Miles and Huberman, and you talked about the last one is verification. And is it triangulation? And I'm wondering, because also discussing with other researcher and your director, because they can be multiple explanations. So I'm just wondering that.
Well, triangulation reassures you that the statements you make about your empirical observations are solid, are robust, are supported by reasonably strong evidence. The problem is that moving from what at that time could be still purely a descriptive statement to a theoretical statement. So an explanation of why things, why those regularities occurred. Triangulation reassures you about the existence of empirical regularities. Similarities, differences, sequences, progressions, co-occurrences, you name them, configurations. But then you need to explain We need an explanation in order to claim a theoretical contribution. And that's where Meitz and Huberman, at least that's not Meitz and Huberman, that's that way of representing the process somehow leaves that out, or leaves it in the, it is in there, but it's not as explicit as I tried to make it here, at least as far as I remember, but I admit I haven't reread Meitz and Huberman yesterday, so I might have been missing something. I'm sure I'm missing something.
Yes, okay, thank you.
Thank you. Katharina.
Hello, very insightful presentation, first of all. And I'm on project researcher working at Cloutier University here, and I'm quite interested also in theorizing, especially process theorizing, and working currently on one paper. It's a single based case study, but with rich data, and where we approach the data analysis also kind of inductively, but we are trying to understand what is the process, how it looks like. And as far as I know, of course, we all know the abductive, inductive approach, and this new retroduction was really something new. And I'm kind of struggling to understand what is the difference between abduction, because with abduction, we also don't enter the field with an empty mind and try to seek for some serious explanations during the process of analyzing data. And as we remember, there was also one presentation from Van de Ven previously, also as a part of the seminars, where Professor Van de Ven was stating about like kind of exercise in creating hunches when you analyze the data, that you try to seek for anomalies, that you try to puzzle, surprise yourself while doing the research and analyzing the data, but you also try to seek for some kind of understanding or theoretical explanations in the theory. So could you maybe explain and elaborate a bit better what is the difference between abduction and this newly introduced retroduction? So kind of to have key features, what distinguishes, as you see, between those approaches? Thank you very much.
I know it sounds, I don't care. Honestly, I don't care. I said I'm not a methodologist. I think I have an understanding of what abduction is, and I'm sure that however I define abduction here, somebody will say, but that's not abduction. And personally, I don't even label my research anymore. I don't say it's inductive, because if you say it's inductive, somebody will say, no, it's really abductive. Then you say abductive, somebody will say, no, but that's not real abduction. Abduction is something else. So as I said, I think I found retroduction. I like the idea of retroduction, but I said, don't quote me on this. I'm a humble worker. I'm a humble craftsman and tinkerer. I'm just showing you how to try to use data in a way that will help you produce some theoretical explanations. Call it whatever you feel more comfortable. Don't make, my suggestion would be, don't write it. Like when you write the methodology, don't make any statements about your research being inductive, abductive, or because as long as it kind of makes sense, as long as you're not, I don't know, testing hypotheses with discourse analysis, that's okay, nobody will argue. But the moment you label your research in a way, somebody will come and say, but that's not exactly like that. So I know this is a very practical statement, and I'm kind of uncomfortable that this is going to be recorded, and then I will be held responsible for whatever. But yeah, no, I think that, and I will get to that later, I think we have to be honest to our data. And try to produce the most reasonable, plausible explanation that we have, given the evidence we have, and make all the efforts we can to find evidence that may challenge our tentative interpretations. I don't think that labeling what we do really contributes to increase the value of what we do, as long as you are mindful that there are some fundamental ontological and epistemological premises that you need to be to keep in mind.
Okay, thank you very much.
No problem. There are 3 more questions. I think it was Josh, then Sergey, and then Efe. And then maybe we will continue because I still have, like, as I said, I'm not even halfway.
Yes, so thank you for your presentations. I really enjoyed this new method.
It's not a new method, it's just...
or a new way of describing how you really proceed with the case studies.
Yes.
So I personally work with the historical case studies.
Yes.
And you mentioned it's important to explain why and the mechanisms. But when you are looking at historical case study, the people are maybe from a few decades ago. You couldn't really interview them. So in that situation, how could you really answer these why questions or the mechanism questions?
Well, you're still making inferences, right?
Yeah.
Even if you cannot talk to people, you're still making inferences based on data you have, and you're coming up with a theoretical explanation that has to be plausible. There's a lot of persuasiveness. There's a lot of ruling out alternative explanations based on the evidence you have. There's going to be a PDW dedicated to historical case studies at the Common Academy of Management, so look for that. And if you send me an email, I think I can retrieve the information for you.
Yeah, thanks again for...
no problem. Yeah. Sergey.
David, I'm monitoring the chat on YouTube. So we have more than 100 participants on YouTube. So I'm translating their questions. So I think I have 3 questions. One is really easy question. It concerns to your research with Alessandro and Patrick.
Yes.
I know that you joined the team a bit later than Alessandro and Patrick. And the question is whether the research question mutated during your analysis of the data, and you've done impressive work there. So
the framing changed.
Yeah.
And we will talk about that in the webinar number 3.
All right, great. So question number 2 then. So you talk about theory, but little you talk about the theorizing. So I think the question concerns to that leap, all right, from data to explanations.
That's the second part. The second part is about that. This is already about theorizing, yeah, because this is the what I try to do here is to show you what you have to aim for, and then I will discuss how visuals help the theorizing, the process of theorizing.
All right, great. And question number 3, you mentioned context, but it looks like you treat it as static. All right, so, and it might introduce boundaries. All right, so what about this?
I think that whether it's static or whether it's dynamic, it depends on the time span of your study. It depends on, so I make no assumption about the context being static or dynamic. If your study spans 10 years, then the context is probably dynamic. And if it's a study of something that happens within one day, it may be dynamic or may not. And there are parts of the context that change, or to me, it's an empirical question.
All right, thank you very much. David, I keep monitoring the chat and I'll come back with some more questions. Thank you.
So we have 3 more, and then I would really go on, if you don't mind. Efe, then Sylvia, and then Hung.
Hi, thanks, David, and thank you, Ibrat and Sergey, for organizing this. During the presentation, you did make reference to the experience that there is, limited explanation about how to do analysis, and this has been my experience really in my thesis, which I am submitting in a few days. So following on from that, I do have 2 questions. So on the slide here, there's the emphasis on explaining mechanisms. So, to demonstrate theorizing, can you just give an example of how to explain the mechanisms? And the second question is, when you refer to mechanisms, what exactly do you mean? Can you give some examples of what a mechanism is and how you could search for that within your empirical observation?
So again, I think that and maybe it wasn't clear, but the examples, the last 3 slides that I showed were meant to be examples of just that. Okay. So here, for instance, the explanation is what I call theoretical account. The empirical observation, the empirical regularity that we noticed is that some organizations that define themselves in terms of the cause that they pursued didn't change much over time. And some organizations that define themselves in terms of the beneficiaries, they instead periodically altered the scope of their activities, expanded, contracted, and so on and so forth. So why was that? What was the underlying mechanism leading these organizations to make these choices? We looked at self-categorization and as a cognitive mechanism, and at how self-categorization shapes what we pay attention to and how we evaluate potential growth opportunities. And using this, we articulated some underlying mechanisms driving, explaining these trajectories that we observed in terms of how self-categorization shapes the search for opportunities within or outside the boundaries of the outside categorical boundaries. Okay, so this is what I mean by an explanation, what I label theoretical account. That's the explanation. If you notice, it's a general explanation. It's at the present tense. It's not in the past tense. This is a past tense because these are empirical observations, what we saw happening. This is expressed in the present tense because this is the more general mechanism that we argue is at play when organizations grow and evolve over time. Is it clearer?
Yes, it is. Thanks a lot.
Thank you for pushing me to clarify this. Silvia.
Yeah. Thank you and good afternoon, everybody. I'm Silvia I'm a PhD candidate from the School of Management at Politecnico di Milano. And so my question is, I'm just gonna kind of read what I wrote in the chat to try to be brief. But as a junior researcher, my biggest struggle is to find what you called the theoretical premise. So the right theory to interpret the empirical observations that I gathered or that we gathered as a co-author team. And the problem is that the body of theoretical knowledge that we find is not really systematized and organized. And therefore, often finding the right theory to explain the empirical phenomena is more a product of intuition, of creativity. So I was wondering whether you have any recommendation to somehow, I know this, there may be no answer to this, but I was wondering if somehow you have some advice on how to do this, on how to find the right theoretical premise.
Read a lot. When I was the director of the PhD at CAS, now Bayes Business School, I had students doing mandatory modules in fundamentals of sociology, fundamentals of cognitive psychology, organization theory, strategy, innovation, like regardless of your research interest, I wanted all students to be exposed to fundamental theories across the board at micro, meso, macro level, things that they could go back to and then familiarize themselves more in case they felt the need to. I think that that's also one of the reasons why it's easier for a senior person to do this, because we have a repertoire that is much richer. We have been exposed to a lot of different theories, and so our brain can retrieve more easily something. So I think that this preparatory stage is important.
Thank you. Something to invest on for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. Last question, and then we go back to the second part. Hung.
Hello, everybody. Thank you very much, Cynthia, for your great question. I think it's the same question for all of them, all of us. Can you hear me?
Yes, yes, we can.
My question is quite in line with her question. I think that there is a tendency that many scholars in the field of organization and management theory using a lot of theory from sociology, because organization is just a small species of society. So do you think that this is a good way to do for OMT scholars? We just pick up a book on sociology and find a theory and trying to fit it to our empirical data.
Okay, now we're getting, so I wouldn't say that you pick up, no, I wouldn't do that, like just browse through, but I don't know. You're mentioning sociology, but I've also read a lot of social psychology, social cognition, depending on the level of analysis. It's not that OMT is about psychology, about sociology. So, and there's, OMT is really at the intersection of different disciplines. And yes, it may seem that sociology is dominant, but I think as a former chair of OMT, I wouldn't do justice to the richness of the division if I said that OMT is just about sociology. And it may be that, yes, if you have the impression that certain theories may be useful to explain your study, that's great. But the problem is, how do you know what is relevant? To me, it's really important to make an investment in some disciplinary backgrounds and in some theoretical foundation. And sometimes you present your work and some people say, you know what, there's this theory that would be great for you to explain what you're just saying. And then you go, oh, that's great. And then you go and pick it up and you familiarize with that. I don't think that's also a good recommendation. Like, show your tentative early ideas to other people, present in brown bag meetings, in consortia, in track symposia, workshops, and sometimes people in the audience will tell you, you know what, you should really use this theory to explain this. And that's also part of how it happens. Thanks. Shall we move on? So now I would like to move to the second part, using visuals and tables in particular to support theorizing. I love tables, okay? And my doctoral students make fun of me and saying that I'm obsessed with tables, but I think that tables are very, very useful. Now, if you think about it, if we accept the idea of theory building as essentially a sense-making effort, an attempt to make sense of a chaotic reality that we experience as we enter the field, and sense-making is really about bringing order into chaos. Then tables do just that. Tables help theory building by bringing order to an otherwise rich and chaotic database. And I just published a paper together with my friend Charlotte Cloutier on the use of tables in qualitative research. And if you're interested in learning more about tables, you can go and look at this paper. I'm not going through the whole thing, because in this paper, we focus on how tables can support qualitative research more generally. But I will focus on the analysis. And I think that from an analytical point of view, there are three things that table can really help you with when doing case studies or qualitative research more generally. First, tables, I found tables absolutely essential to examine this intuitive early insight more systematically. They help you lay out your observation in a way that help you see if there are effectively these regularities, or if there are gaps, if there is enough evidence to support certain statements. Like one of the most common tables that perform this function is the data table in the Joya methodology. This is just an example of what Charlotte and I call concept evidence table. It means tables that gather and display evidence available for every concept that is part of your model. I use these tables a lot to collect evidence as I move on, just to be sure that these intuitive early coding and classifications are supported by enough evidence. I will tell you more about coding next week in the webinar dedicated to grounded theory and the Joya methodology. Another table that I found very useful is an extension of this concept evidence table that highlights triangulation more explicitly. This is an example from a paper by Sutton and Hargadon, where they show how they got evidence from multiple sources of data for every specific observation that they made. They label strong evidence, moderate evidence, and they tell you what it means, and they give you some examples. And again, this is important to reassure your reviewers or your readers that your statements about your data were not based on anecdotal or episodic or occasional evidence, but were robustly supported. The table we saw earlier from the robotic surgery study is an example of a table where you show triangulation from multiple sources. Or this is another example of a table that shows triangulation from multiple sources. When it comes to tables, there are some general templates, but there's really no standard. You really have to learn how to properly structure your table to perform what it is supposed to perform. Tables can also be very useful to analyze data by highlighting patterns. So it's not just about collecting evidence, but also highlighting, coming up with insights in the first place, showing similarities and differences, or showing that things happen together, some features manifest together, or showing that things change over time or tends to follow one another in always the same ways. And again, I would invite you to go back to that article if you want to learn more about it. But tables can be very useful to ordering cases to reveal some patterns. This is typically what Kathy Eisner does in her multiple case studies, arranging your cases in a way that shows how those organizations that decide more quickly tend to be characterized by the search for alternatives or the timing in which they evaluate different alternatives that differs from those that decide more slowly. And this is a way to show, again, patterns that may not be perfect, but they reasonably support some general statements about what it takes to decide more quickly or more slowly. Tables can also be very useful to structure some comparisons. This comes from a paper on the implementation of Six Sigma at 3M, and one of the early intuitive insight was that there was some fundamental differences culturally between the values embodied and the assumptions embodied in Six Sigma and the values and assumptions that characterize the culture of 3M. And we structure this table along the types of assumptions according to Ed Schein's theory of culture, and comparing very clearly how these assumptions differed between 3M and Six Sigma, and documenting in this way the cultural clash between the existing culture and the new practice. Tables can be very useful when you say, well, there are things that are different or that are similar. Okay, put them in a table and show me analytically all the features that distinguish these two things or that make these two things similar. It's also very useful to support your own reflection about things. Tables can be used to track temporal progression or can be used to map phases. Anne Langley talks about temporal bracketing as a strategy to analyze qualitative data when you're aiming for a process model. A table can be very useful to show how things change from phase 1 to phase 2 to phase 3 in a relatively structured way, identifying relevant constructs, like in this case, the fidelity and extensiveness of the implementation of a practice, and showing how fidelity and extensiveness change from phase 1 to phase 2 to phase 3, a little summary and some evidence. And finally, tables can be used to analyze data by keeping track of the analytical steps or the criteria you use for coding. Sometimes you develop some coding schemes as you analyze data. And this, for instance, was a table that Charlotte and I produced in order to clearly define the various classification criteria for the change episodes that we noticed in these trajectories on the 4 non-profit organizations that I mentioned earlier, and some examples. And this helped us make sure that every time we classified a new change instance, we would classify it in a consistent way. And if we found something that would not fall in any of these definitions, we would either add some more criteria or we would alter the definition accordingly. So this is something that is very important to make sure that you're maintaining consistency in your coding and in your classification of what you observe. Now, these are 2 very useful tables that I don't think they are mentioned in that article, but if you look at my papers, I've used them a lot. Narrative summaries. Narrative summaries are great. To me, it's like the finding section in a glance. It's a summary of all your observations organized around the fundamental construct that constitute your emerging model. This is from my paper with Mike and Schultz, and you can see how here we had the various elements that define the process model, the various stages, and we were showing how these stages manifested empirically in the 3 different change instances that we studied. The findings, the finding section of the paper essentially was, you take these 3 columns, you put them one after the other, there goes your finding section. Or you take these lines, you put them one after the other, there goes your finding section, depending whether you want to structure it historically or theoretically. But once you have this, that's a template for the content of your finding section. And it ensures that on the one hand, there is a coherence between the structure of the findings and the structure of your model. And it gives the reader the possibility to understand with a single glance, a single overview, like this is what the findings are about. Do I want to understand how various stages manifest in different instances? I read the table by row. I want to understand what happened in every change instance. I read the table by column. I think it's very, very useful. And you can organize it that way, or you can organize it, for instance, by phases of a process and highlighting the fundamental constructs that define what happens in each phase and how these occur differently from phase to phase. Or you can use it again, fundamental constructs and how they manifest themselves in different cases. This comes from a paper with Ileana Stigliani, the paper about sense-making in designers' projects. And we had various practices, material recording, browsing and collecting, this part of our observations that manifested in every single case we studied, transport, health, there were 3 of them. And this, you will not find it in the paper, but it was part of the second submission. And it was very important for us to show reviewers that actually those pieces of our model that we claim we observed were robustly supported through all the cases. And you could easily understand what happened in a case by reading column by column. Narrative summaries, keep them in mind. It may not always, it works best whenever you have some element of comparisons, different cases, different phases, different incidents, because it really helps you structure constructs by whatever element of comparison you have. And then another very useful, a theoretical summary. This table, a narrative summary is really about empirical observations. The content of cells are empirical observations. Here, the content of cells are theoretical arguments. This is a summary of your theorization, a summary of how these 2 trajectories that we that we saw in the paper with Charlotte, identity refinement, identity enrichment, where what were the theoretical components of these trajectories? What were the mechanisms behind? This is really, again, a template for your grounded model section of the paper. And I use this. This is very useful to make sure that you have completely theorized all your model. And it works best when you have multiple phases, multiple cases, multiple patterns. There's an element of comparison. Tables work well when you have an element of comparison. Otherwise, it's less valuable, let's say. An example, again, of using tables to search for patterns in multiple case studies, not the way Eisner does it. So this, we were looking for, not for an explanation for variance, we were looking for patterns more generally, similarities and differences. And this was a study where we look at family mottos in ancient Japanese firms, and we try to understand what these firms did when they had to change these mottos because they were changing circumstances, but still they were infused with a lot of symbolism, and they had a hard time simply replacing them. And so we first compare all the mottos, focused on a few case studies where they had changed these mottos, or they hadn't, but that the company was still alive in a way, because we had a database of very old mottos. And then we compared the various change episodes. And the analysis was really based on building these long tables, where for every discursive strategy that we identified intuitively in the beginning, we tracked all the main elements. So how this strategy manifested, what were the contextual conditions, what were the strategic implications for every change episode in every company. And this was really useful to classify, reclassify, sharpen our understanding and notice some patterns and similarities. And then based on that, we produced a theoretical summary that says, all in all, a comparative analysis showed some like these 5 strategies. And here are the strategies and their definition. And these strategies are characterized by the association with a different context, different implications for strategy making, and different means of establishing continuity. Well, the means of establishing continuity were the mechanisms, the theoretical explanation for how a certain strategy was associated, was adopted in certain contextual conditions and produced certain outcomes. Vrinda, you have a question, and now there's a little break before I start talking about visuals. So why don't we take this question?
Thank you, David. Am I audible?
Yes.
Yes. Yeah. Hi. Good evening from India. I'm an early stage PhD scholar from India. My question to you, sir, was I was trying to understand the difference between the use of tables and how does the Jua method, where he talks about taking in the coding from what the respondents have said, their sense,
yes.
And he goes into data structures thereafter. So what is the difference between your way of doing it versus that? Is there a difference, or am I not getting?
No. So sometimes I do it exactly like Danny does. I follow his template wholeheartedly. And some of the examples that I gave you, the first order codes really try to capture the informant's interpretations of their own reality.
Right.
This last example that I gave you, this was more like a historical case study, a set of historical case studies.
Right.
So we didn't have much in terms of interviews to work with.
Right.
In some cases, we're reconstructing events occurring in 1868 based on the available documentation. So we were searching for patterns there, trying to reconstruct historical events as accurately as possible, and then going back to one of the prior questions, try to make inferences about why certain types of, certain ways of engaging with the past seem to be associated more frequently with certain problems and certain strategic intents. And then coming up with some inferences that seem to be plausible explanations and somehow corroborated by the data. So there's no, it is just a different ways of using tables.
Okay, okay. So it's more going into Anne Langley's approach in terms of.
Look, I don't know.
I'm just trying to. I'm struggling to understand at the moment.
Yes, I don't know exactly how Anne uses tables.
Okay.
I suppose that she also does it in a relatively flexible way.
But thank you. Your approach is very, very, very user friendly. I find it very good. So I'm going to be using this. Thank you so much.
That. Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you. Katerina.
Yes, but I think Sergey was the first to raise a hand. If Sergey...
Ladies first. Sergey is
actually... All right. Thank you very much. So I wanted actually to ask, so you recommend like to use this narrative summaries during the data analysis or during the data collection process. But how about when you are conducting, for example, an action research, and you're collecting data, let's say, on a digital platform, so real time, and I have a group of researchers. With them, I also have an interaction, and we kind of reflect on what we are doing and creating this narrative summaries or stories, the way we call it. So, but in a way, when we analyze our data, so how do you see the applicability, basically, of this narrative summaries approach in action research in particular? So, and do you maybe see some other approach that you could also recommend, especially if you are dealing with digital qualitative data collection and analysis, let's say on a digital platform, where you see interaction between the people that they're creating the content, basically your data that you will analyze later? How would you deal with this data? Would you still recommend to use the tables? Of course, documenting the process. I usually also do this.
I will stop you there.
Yeah, thanks.
I have no answer. I talk about things that I think I know, and I have never done action research. I think it's a very interesting method. I've never had an opportunity to do it myself. So I simply...
I understand. No problem. If anybody from the audience wishes to answer or has an answer to my question, feel free to do so.
Yes, I'm sorry. I prefer to stick to what I think I know rather than...
Anyways, thank you very much. Thank you.
Sergey. Thank you, Davide. Yeah, we have a question from YouTube. Question from Sunitha. She asks whether it's appropriate to use metaphors in theorizing, at what stage and to what extent?
That's a good question. I think that metaphors are very useful, but you need to be able to explain the metaphor. Metaphors are very powerful to convey some ideas, but very often, as a reviewer, as an editor, I see metaphors, the use of metaphors conceals some theoretical looseness. So using a metaphor as a shortcut, not to really articulate the mechanism. So well, it's great, use the metaphor, but you always have to be able to explain it. And by this, I mean, and there has to be an analytical explanation. At least that's my view, because if you leave it at the sometimes remaining at metaphorical level may really be an excuse not to grapple with the fundamental theoretical mechanisms underlying, which is something that, at least the way I see it, we should try to bring out. But I know that some colleagues may disagree with that. That's how I see it.
Right. Thank you very much, David. In short, thank you. Great, you've done properly.
Hung, and then we really move on because it's late and I still have a few things to show you.
Yeah, I will speak very quickly. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, I think I really like this method using some visualization for your research. But do you think that is too innovative to follow? I will explain why I asked this question. Because, by example, some recent software can do exactly what you did, and in a very beautiful way. By example, the Sankey diagram of Atlas, it can draw many beautiful tables with colors. But the problem is many journals, now it's a very dramatic question. They can only accept you for the black and white version. So yeah, the black and white text, not color text, not colorful tables. So in this case, what will you do?
Well, that's odd though, because now it's all digital. So you submit something digital, and if it's in color, it will be, I don't know. I honestly, I didn't think this was a problem anymore. This is something that can certainly be arranged with the editors. If you think that colors are necessary in your visuals, and a grayscale would not help you show the patterns that you want to show, I think that's something that can be discussed with the editorial office, and it can be arranged. It doesn't seem to be a problem, but maybe I don't know. There's something that
So just a suggestion that if someone uses Atlas, you can try the latest version with the Sankey diagram instead of visualization. Very good.
Great, whatever works for you. I'm old school. Okay, so visuals. Now we're talking about digital. Actually, you will see how my visuals are often very, very simple. Earlier, somebody asked about theorizing, and here I think we're getting to the core of how theorizing works for me. Visualization is very important, and I think I wrote something about it in a Journal of Management Inquiry. Danny Joy invited me to write something about it. Together with Alan Langley, we talked about, we published this paper on research on the sociology of organization, when we show different types of visuals that can help you at different stages as you move from data to theory. And again, if you want to learn more about this, go and have a look at that paper. I'm not going to go through the whole content. In that paper, we talk about various types of tables, for instance, tables that help you organize your observations, very highlighting linkages between empirical observations, activities, or various resources. This is something that can certainly help you make sense or identify patterns in your data. But when it comes to theorizing, for me, everything starts with sketches, with just writing down on a piece of paper some ideas about the relevant constructs and how they are related. If you think about it, a theory in its essence, and I know that I'm simplifying a bit, but in essence, you can see a theory as a set of constructs, concepts, and relationships among them. Right? Concepts that it can be a process model, it can be a variance model, it can be a mix of the two, but it's still like there are some elements and they are connected somehow, either by causal relationships or recursive relationships or temporal relationships. And to me, sketching is the very first attempt to pin down and bring out of my head the relevant concepts and trying to find a way to understand better how they are related by visualizing them so that I can reflect more explicitly on those. This is really, by pulling them out and visualizing them on paper, it facilitates, in my case, the reflection on these. And sketching is something that starts very, very early. So these are printouts of, these are copies of transcripts from my study with Ileana on designers. And you can see that as I was coding already, I was already writing down like snippets of theories of relevant concepts and linkages, because really this is how it works. It's not linear. It's not that first I code everything and then I put all the constructs together. No, you start coding, you already develop some intuitive ideas that drive further coding, and then little by little you put all of these things together, and until you develop more broader early sketches. And then the next step is theorizing the arrows. Once you have identified the relevant constructs and you have linked them with arrows, it's important to ask yourself, what do these arrows mean? And too often I see, again, papers or colleagues asking me for, and I see all these models with all these arrows and it's not explained. And it's not explained even in the text. I said, well, how are these two things connected? Why? And this was perhaps the first time that it's a paper from 2011 that it was a very complex model, and we forced ourselves to explain every single error. And by the way, Theorize the Errors is not mine. It's Anne Langley's and Martha Feldman. I don't want to take credit for this. I'm just using it, and I think it's very important. And I do it every time. And in this case, the errors were theorized right in the, they stayed theorized in the published version. In other cases, we theorized them, we submitted with theorized errors so that reviewers can see, so that then we can take all those bits of text and build the theoretical, the theorization of the model in the paper. But then the model is cleaned up so you wouldn't see them. But I tell you, every paper I write, every error is theorized. Absolutely. And then you take that text, you put it in the paper, and you build your theorization of the model around it. Visuals can also be very useful when you're working with co-authors. This is an example from another paper that was published in Org Studies, where I started with an intuitive representation of the ways to putting together the various things that were coming out of the analysis. I sent it to my co-authors, and then what I got back was an evolution that kind of changed some of the things, and then I sent it back. And you can see how the visuals became the way in which we built on each other's ideas, in which we added to this evolving, emerging theorization until we found some representation that we were all comfortable with. A particular type of theory of visual representation that I found useful when theorizing is what I call a visual comparison. And again, I use it a lot. This is from the paper on the Japanese ancient mottos. We showed how each, this is an attempt to visualize each strategy that was followed to handle with these ancient mottos, using some similar visual elements. And by doing this, conveying the idea that there was a common theoretical infrastructure. By using similar visual signs, reassuring reviewers that these 3, 4, 5 strategies were not not heterogeneous, but there was some common theory. There were some common elements that were simply displayed differently in different strategies. And this is another example for another paper, Study of Corporate Museums, and again, different ways of representing these 3 ways of relating history and identity that were showing how these 3 forms of engagement were really using the 3 different ways to connect past and present. And by the way, this is something that I improvised during a seminar to explain to people in the audience. Like, actually, let me see if I can explain you visually. And I do this, and I said, this actually looks good. I took a picture, and then it went straight into the next submission. And this is an interesting story because it's really a story of how visualization helps theorization. This paper, it was published a couple of years ago, it had been in the making forever. It had been we've been working on it and rewriting, and we sent it to AMJ, and it got an R&R, but they really wanted something more, something else. So I was interviewing more people, going back out in the field, and already this is what I was writing on a notepad in between interviews at Alfa Romeo. New ways of a new angle to look at the study, not at an organizational level, but more at individual level or role level. And you can see how at this stage already there is this early ideas that there are 3 different ways characterized by 3 different emotional stances like wonder, awe, pride. You can see it now in the bottom on the right. And that stayed in the back of my mind. And then here I am on a plane to Munich to present this paper. And again, this is for my notepad, trying to elaborate on this and showing, okay, this is, if this is what's happening inside, there are different audiences out there. There's broader society, there are the fans, there are potential clients, and maybe different types of relating history and identity are aiming at different audiences. And then I'm writing more and more on this. And this is another page, and still I'm on the plane. And then I noticed that there's something in this model, like there are empty spaces. And I said, well, why are there empty spaces? What's in there? And then I start thinking, okay, but maybe there are opportunities there to link these various ways and to show that there are tensions. And I start elaborating, and it's like, yeah, that's right. These things are in tension with one another. There's a tension between analysis and synthesis. There's a tension between the whole and the pieces. And that drove later a more systematic engagement with the data to find evidence for this, and eventually became the new theoretical framework where we identify the various tensions across among the different ways of engaging with history and identity. And this was really visualization driving theorization. Unfortunately, in the end, this was too much. Like the reviewers also wanted to see the process, and there's only so much you can do with the visual. So the tensions eventually disappeared, but they were absolutely central in the way we understood. They remain hinted at somehow within the text. And I don't know if you want to take one little break, or there's 10 more minutes, and maybe we can conclude with this, and then if there's any more question, we can take them at the end. Or I see Alicia. Okay, one question, and then we move on. Alicia.
Okay, thank you. Because I also do some crafting manually, my papers and so on, but how do you justify your model or what you just draw with coding, with tables, with triangulation, and so on?
Well, everything has to hang together at the end. No? You don't necessarily disclose all the various intermediate steps. What matters is that you show them that whatever interpretation you came up with at the end is robustly supported by evidence that you collected. And then in the editorial process, you're able to persuade them that whatever alternative explanation they come up with, actually yours is better.
Okay.
Like you don't necessarily disclose all the process. Like sometimes you do. Sometimes you say, we tried this, we collected this data, and actually revealed that this was not the case, and we went that direction, and it worked. So sometimes you do disclose this. Otherwise, that you just have like 4 or 5 pages to talk about your methodology.
Thank you.
Dolores.
Thanks, Professor Ravasi. Thanks for your talk. And my question is about, I'm trying to draft a conceptual paper, trying to reconceptualize a construct. So I introduce a figure with a conceptual model, but because of the arrows, it's always read as a process model.
Yeah.
So it's always, the question is always how you operationalize these things, and they are like the structure of the concept. So I'm trying to figure out how to introduce a figure or something that make clearer the concept, but I have this problem.
So yes, figures would deserve a whole webinar just for that. And usually what I do, when I give workshops about this, I ask people to send me their stuff in advance, and we discuss them in class, because yes, you can come up with a few general archetypal figures, but then it's endless. Now, every theory deserves some particular tweak, and it's difficult to say, oh, do this and you'll be fine, especially when it comes to process theories, because with variance theories, we have a clear vocabulary. It's boxes and arrows, and everybody knows. But with process theories, it's more complex, and we don't have the same established visual vocabulary. So I hear your pain, but unfortunately, I don't have universal recipe that I can give you and say, do this and you'll be fine. It's really about trying and see how people respond and modify based on their response.
Thank you very much.
No problem. 10 minutes. What does it mean to do rigorous case study research? So this is, I think it's important. It may not be, so this is perhaps the most important part, because it's about the mindset. It's about the way in which you should approach case studies or qualitative research more generally. And a few years ago, Kevin Corlin, Danny Joya, and other colleagues, they were writing about a chapter about rigor in qualitative research. They asked me and they asked many other people, what do we think about rigor in what makes qualitative research rigorous? And I answered with a metaphor, and I said, look, you know, if you look at a positivistic perspective on research, tends to equate rigor with careful planning and execution. And you're rigorous as long as you replicate exactly the protocol, as you stick to the plan, as there's no interference. And this is the rigor of scientists, of engineers. And in qualitative research, I think that's not what being rigorous is about. Being rigorous in qualitative research is the rigor of the investigative journalist or the detective. There's rigor in there too. Huh? You need to be rigorous in your inquiry, but it's a different kind of rigor. Because you have to be open to the unexpected. Now, rigor in qualitative research is not following a rigid protocol for data collection and analysis. Rigor is about, you're not rigorous if you try to minimize surprises. You're rigorous if you remain open to surprises, if you remain open to unexpected observations. Going back to what Andy van der Ven said in an earlier webinar. And you use these surprises to reorient your data collection. Like, oh, okay, no, I thought this was the explanation, but looking at this data, actually, that's not the case. I need to go in a different direction, collect additional data, revisit my tentative provisional explanations, sharpen them in light of what I'm observing. You have to be, this is very important, intellectually honest. This is crucial because we are not asked, thank God, to disclose to the reviewers all our database. And even if we did, how could they track exactly what we did and everything? So there is an element of trust. We reviewers trust you, author, that or us authors, that we honestly approach our analysis. And by intellectual honesty, what I mean is, like, we do not conceal evidence that may question our provisional interpretation. This is crucial because if we don't do this, the whole thing falls apart. If we find something that doesn't fit, and we have to deliberately, first of all, we have to deliberately look for sources and evidence that may challenge these interpretations. If everybody seems to support a certain interpretation, try to think about people that may support an alternative interpretation. Would everybody agree in these organizations? Would somebody offer a different perspective or a different voice? Go and talk to them. Is there available archival data that may possibly disprove these interpretations from my informants? Go and check for those data. And if you find something that doesn't quite fit, you don't sweep it under the carpet. You try to use it to refine your theorizing. Now, how is this possible? Like, how to, maybe there are different identities in that organizations, different cultures, there are different views, there are different interests. Maybe some interpretations are based on limited information. Why did everybody believe this when archival data says that was not the case? So there may be interesting social, cognitive, psychological dynamics at play there. Maybe people are not lying. It's just that they were completely misrepresenting their reality. But then there must be a reason. So all of this has to be taken into account. If a case doesn't fit with all the other cases, you have to explain why is that. And then maybe you will find an interesting contextual condition that you hadn't considered. And this will push you to search for more cases like that, or for more people like that. And that eventually will enrich your analysis and make it more plausible, more faithful to your data. This is absolutely crucial. So you really have to be a good detective even when you're collecting the data. And what does it mean? It means that you have to check your sources and get the facts right. Don't take things as they're given to you. Always ask for exemplifications. Whenever an informant makes a statement, that's very interesting. Can you please elaborate? Can you give me some examples? Not just write down what they say without challenging them. And sometimes, sometimes I do say, this is interesting, but I heard something different from your colleagues. How do you explain that? Don't be afraid to challenge if you notice some discrepancies. Be accurate, detailed, precise in your reporting. Be very specific. Facts, figures, names, events. The more detailed you are, the more credible you are, because you reassure your reviewers that you've done a thorough job. You just didn't get just an intuitive, superficial understanding of things, but you went deep down. You checked your sources, you got your facts right, and here are the facts. Facts. Here are the facts, or the statements that I heard, that I listened to, or what review, like whatever evidence I base my interpretations on, I give you an accurate and rich selection of this evidence, so that it reassures you that I've done my job properly. So document all your assertions. Every statement you make about your site, about your phenomenon, has to be documented. Quotes, figures, facts. Again, reassuring that you've done your job right, as if you were in court and you were to persuade a jury that your reconstruction about the murderer is sufficiently solid for the judge to say, you know what, yes, guilty or innocent or whatever. Now, the difference is that a detective or a journalist, they explain a particular event. We have to make the additional step. We have to make the additional step and not only find the most plausible explanation for what you observe, but this explanation should be also formulated in theoretical terms, using the process that I refer to as retroduction. And guess what? Do you know who is was considered who's using retroduction? Detectives. When I read about retroduction and I found retroduction is what is the mode of inference that is typically adopted by detectives, it was like, bah, that's it. That's what I do. It all fits with my general metaphor for what we do as being a good detective or a good investigative journalist. This is the mode of inference that's associated with discovery. And a lot of what we do is really about discovering something about reality that we did not expect or we were not aware of before. And I would stop here, I would say, and thank you all. Thank you for those that stayed with us for 2 hours. I can talk for 2 hours, 3, but listening for 2 hours, the applause should really go to you, not to me. But I'm here and I'm happy to stay for a little longer in case you have questions.
Davide, thank you. I think we could probably keep listening to your talk for another hour, I'm guessing. It was so interesting.
Well, we'll be back on this stage a week from now with the Joya methodology and some reflections on template more generally. So there's more.
Thank you. Questions?
Vrinda, your hand is raised. Do you have a?
Yes, I am. I'm the curious cat, I think, in the lot. I just want to understand triangulation as a process as well. How does one bring that into quality?
Always. So triangulation to me is a principle. Like sometimes it's just not possible. Okay, but ideally you should try to do your best to double check your emerging, like double check the extent to which various parts of your database support this emerging interpretations. So I think that one of the typical pitfalls with case studies is that we have a big database, we have 50 interviews, we code those interviews, and we build their story all around those interviews. And I've been there and I've done that. So and then reviewers come back to you and says like, but how come you're using only your interviews? You've got this amazing database. And it's like, yeah, that's right. Why am I using my interviews? And then you go there and you find additional evidence, and sometimes you discover new things by actually looking at the actual sources that were produced in real time at the time of the change or whatever. So you should really try to do it as soon as possible.
Right. Where I'm coming from is that I'm researching women entrepreneurs, so they are individuals. So I'm struggling with how to triangulate. So I can interview them. I'm interviewing them, but how do I triangulate that data?
What you're studying.
For example, how their life journey of becoming an entrepreneur.
Yes.
Right. So
so put me in touch with one of my doctoral students, Ardra, who's studying very similar thing. Maybe.
Fantastic. That'll be great. That'll be great.
Well, so sometimes triangulation is also about talking to other people that may offer you useful perspective. So talking to their funders, talking to their colleagues, co-founders, family members. If you're really focused on their personal experience, then talking to people around them may help you put what they say in perspective.
Right.
And maybe they have produced documents that talk about themselves. Maybe they presented themselves in some circumstances. Maybe they, depending on what you really want to know about them, there may be some sort of archival documents that may help you with that.
Right. Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you.
Anoop.
Hi, Davide. Good to see you. Thanks for the wonderful presentation. I really enjoyed how you opened up some of the black boxes that often get concealed under the section called data analysis. So it was wonderful to see that. I have two specific questions for you. First question being, how do you go about deciding whether the single case study approach is the right approach for the research question that you're asking? And the second question is, you've also been very, very productive, in terms of getting publications out, which are, I can only assume, the data gathering and analysis takes quite a bit of time. So how do you manage that?
So in terms of single versus multiple, that's really if I only have access to a single case, then I go with a single case. If I manage to have access to multiple cases, I go with multiple. It's really about constraints. Sometimes some cases are. So
more than single was multiple cases. My specific question was around how do you match the phenomena with your single case methodology? Because presumably you're trying to either investigate a phenomena or you're trying to investigate some kind of theory, right?
Well, but you see, actually, so when you go single case, it's often the case that drives the framing. Now you select the case because you have a look at what's happening and you think that this may be a great case to illuminate something. Multiple cases, you go with multiple cases to study some more general process that you can easily observe across multiple settings, rather than something that happens rarely. So when you're studying, if you want to understand identity, like how identity influences change or vice versa, it's very difficult to find, and you want to really zoom in, it's difficult to find a lot of comparable cases, and then you really want to understand that stuff, you need to go in depth and interview maybe 50, 60, 70 people. So that also in terms of temporal constraints, you can only do a single case. But there are other things that you can study in a more focused way, then you don't need to interview everybody. You can zoom out a little, and then you can have multiple cases. So it's really also pragmatic choice. And in terms of being productive, well, some of the stuff that you've seen published recently, they have been in the making since 2006, 2010, 2008. It just takes 10 years to get them published, and you see them arriving all at the same time, but they were really reflecting 10 or 15 years of work before. And then, of course, sometimes I was lucky, or that some colleagues asked me to join projects that were already underway, and that sped up. I just need to spend maybe 2 weeks to familiarize with the database rather than waiting for, I wasn't around for the 2 or 3 years it took them to accumulate that database. And that sped up the process for me. But,
I see. Thank you very much. And just a follow-up question, I mean, so once you've decided that it's going to be single case and that's the research question, how do you then go about finding the organization case study fit? As in, like, this is the right organization where I can actually explore this theoretical question, or this organization provides me with enough material for this, or is it just a case of whichever organization gives you access, let me find what's interesting about it and then work backwards?
Yeah, I only try to study organizations that I'm interested in, and I go in because I'm interested in them, and then I understand better how to frame the study later. The only study that was planned like that was the corporate museum study. I was interested in learning more about corporate museums, so I studied a bunch of corporate museums. But the initial research question wasn't much better than that. I found the phenomenon fascinating. I went out, I found 4 museums that were, companies and museums that were willing to give me access in depth, and then based on that, I produced a paper. But otherwise, usually it was like the case comes first. The case and some general understanding. But the 3M case study that was intended to be a case of identity change, because Jim McNerney had arrived and said, I'm going to change your DNA. I said, okay, let's do this. This is going to be a case of identity change. And then as we were studying the company, we realized that actually it was the reverse. It was a case of our identity eventually opposed or circumscribed the change that could take place in the culture of the organization. So.
And do you promise something to your stakeholders, the people who you do the case with, in terms of?
I don't know. I was lucky. I grew up probably in a different world, or I never found people that needed me to promise anything in return. I always found people that were happy to talk, and well, not everybody, of course. But in general, there was a lot of willingness to engage and discuss and share, and happy that somebody was interested about them. Maybe I was lucky, or maybe it was the kind of companies I started, or maybe the kind of people. When you instead of studying like professional service companies where these people are paid by the minute, and of course every minute that they dedicate to you is less money for them. I was studying Bang & Olufsen or Alfa Romeo, Alessi, and talking with designers, and they were happy to just talk about their work, or brand managers. Like, these guys are, for some of these guys, their job is to have the world talk more about their company. So,
I see. Okay, thank you very much.
No problem. Ibrat.
Thank you, Davide. One of my questions pertains to, at which point do you work out what is this a case of, and how, as you work through your data or collecting data?
That's a good question. And this is a question that we'll talk about, that we'll answer in webinar number 3. So webinar number 3 will be dedicated in part to framing. and framing your study in a way that prepares the ground for a theoretical contribution. And you will see that the framing or reframing can happen late, sometimes halfway through the editorial process. It is not uncommon for a framing to change from first to second submission. After all, if they gave you an R&R and they didn't accept it right away, it means that there was something that they were not very happy with. And in my experience, it is often the framing. They kind of like the data, they kind of like some ideas, but the framing is not convincing. So you work with them and you try to figure out kind of framing maybe interesting for the reviewers seem to be interested in, and would this framing fit your data? And you try to work within these two constraints. And sometimes you start with the framing and you realize that the data do not fit. Sometimes you start with the framing and you realize that it's too contentious, that people, I don't know, there are different camps. So you want to stay away from some turf wars and you give it a different frame. We'll talk more about it in webinar number 3.
If I may, another question, Davide. You earlier alluded to where you try to explain every arrow in the model.
Yes.
But as you illustrated your models, there were also lots of concepts attached to them.
Yes.
Where do those concepts come from? Do they just come from
the coding
data?
No.
Do they also come from the literature as well?
Sometimes they may come from the literature. If they already exist, there's no need to reinvent the wheel. So next week we're going to talk about coding, and I will show you more specifically how I move from a coding to a theorization when doing the Gioia thing. Grounded theory using Dennis Gioia's template. And you will see that I use tables also as a way to structure to theorize the concepts. The table becomes the visual framework that allows me to gradually theorize every single element, show evidence, make sure that the definition written in the table fits the evidence. So that often happens right there in the tables that I use to support the systematic coding of the data.
If I may, just one more based on this. If you start, as you illustrated, for example, on the plane to Munich, you were trying to create and recreate the models. And you have a hunch, perhaps, maybe based on some data that, there are arrows there, but maybe you don't have enough data. What do you do then? Do you go back to collect more data, or what do you do to sort of either confirm your hunch or?
That's what grounded theory is about. You collect more data and you see if these provisional interpretations are supported or not. That's what detectives do. If they have a hunch, they try to find evidence, but they have to do it honestly. They have to, if there's no evidence to be found, your hunch is rejected. And sometimes I've shown you some of the sketches, but there has been more sketching that was discarded because once we got down to the data more closely, so now it doesn't quite support these ideas. Trash, let's start a new sketch.
Okay, thank you.
No problem. Kagla.
Thank you very much for the presentation. That was really great, insightful. I have one quick question about the definition of the case study. I realized that you define it as a boundary system which are bounded by the time and the context, definitely. But when I read some of the...
I defined it that way, but I just said that whatever research we do is a research that takes place at a certain point in time in a certain place.
Yes. Just I confused by the some of the articles which are recently published at the AMJ, for example, child marriage in African context, in particular settings. For example, Close and Tracy, they define it as a case. So they say that they investigate the child marriage in particular context.
Yes.
And in achieving that, they interview with the number of the people from the NGOs or from the ordinary people from the different villages. And to my understanding, that's the field work. So how do you think, would you consider this as a case study? Because when we talk about the case, that should be bounded by the, I don't know, by the organization or, but the boundaries of the system is very broad in that case. So
well, it's a field, no? It's a country, or the case study is not necessarily an organization. A case study can be an incident, an event. It can be an industry. It can be a profession. It can be any social system. So,
but unpacking the field dynamics in that example, for example, I really confused that when they say the child marriage case, they approach as a case study approach. So yes, that's.
So, I don't know. I'm maybe because I'm getting old, but I'm getting less and less interested in labeling what we do than in actually doing it.
Yeah.
So. You don't think that's a case study? You don't want to label it a case study? Fine. Is it convincing otherwise? Yes. Yeah, sure. Then that's okay. So.
Yeah, right. Yeah, there's a great alignment among the research philosophy, data collection, or the data analysis and the presentation.
So.
Yeah.
I would say it's a case study, but to me, a case study is, as I said, it's a residual category. You do a qualitative study and you don't know how to call it a case study, and chances are it will be fine.
Okay, I got it.
Don't quote me on this. Don't put that into your submission. But I think it was Alicia, then Yaran, then Orly, but whatever. I would be here as long as it takes.
Okay, I don't know how much time do we have, but thank you. So. When do you know
I have
that
Professor Nelson Phillips coming over for dinner in a couple of hours? So
okay. So when do you know that you can stick to your explanation and theory construction because of reviewers, also informants, and it's a teamwork. So when do you know, like, okay, that's it, I know there's other explanation, other theory that I can use, or other things, I don't know, but.
So to me is, does it fit with the data? Do we have any inconsistent evidence? This is actually, this explanation explain well this, but these 2-3 things here that they don't quite fit. And we can't quite figure out how they don't fit. Then that's a problem. And the other problem is like, okay, can we provide some theoretical, is there a convincing theoretical explanation there? Or is it just, things went the way they went? Because that's what happened. And to me, that if there's something that doesn't fit, and if we don't have a convincing theoretical explanation that it kind of sounds made up, then, so sense making, Mike has this interesting point. He says, sense making stops when you reach a feeling of order. So there's a lot about, to me, it's really about gut feelings. So, and sometimes it's like it bugs me and it doesn't quite, and even when I'm a reviewer, I say, okay, I can see the reasoning, but it doesn't quite, I don't quite buy it. Now, if my gut feeling says, yeah, kind of makes sense, then I'm comfortable and I send it out, and maybe then the reviewers will come back and say, actually, you didn't notice this, or actually, this could be another interpretation. I go like, sure, okay, whatever, I have to fix it. But I go a lot with gut feelings, but perhaps because the gut feelings is really your brain processing in a relatively unconscious way a lot of things that based on your previous experience. So it may not, my gut feelings may be better than other people's gut feelings because of age and experience. But to me, it's really about, is the evidence supporting, and do we have a convincing theoretical explanation? But I don't know if does this really answer your question?
Yeah, no, it does. Thank you.
Okay. Yaran and Aurélie. We cannot hear you. Yes.
Hello, can you hear me? Hello. Yeah, good afternoon from Germany. Basically, I'm doing also like the family business, but more focused in session series. And what I found, like, I have basically the questions here, like this is the stuff. I'm also doing some of those photography stuff, and and now I'm just doing a part of the interview about the session business from the founder generation to the second generation, even managers. And then I have the basic questions here about the data reductions here, because like, again, because I read about your paper about just Japanese families, entrepreneurs. But what now I'm having the difficulties is like the different industry, the background, maybe they have the different ways, like for example, like the traditional manufacturers, like beverage, food, and this is what we call traditional maybe industry, and from the new technology industry based on the internet, online sales. So now I'm just doing the part of the interview, but now I really have to find out some of my hypotheses here, or the questions I really have to change and adapt. So how to do some recommendations about the data reduction focus, how to divert it like industry or background, especially I'm not sure I understood
I'm not sure I understood exactly what you're trying to say, but it seems to me that you're saying you have different entrepreneurs. Mm-hmm. They're characterized by different backgrounds and other attributes. And you're studying something about these entrepreneurs. Like, what are you interested in what are you studying? What is the research question?
The research question is also the culture influence the founder generation and then the second generation, and how can they see their entrepreneurs, the family business, and even the business families behind the internship. But now basically I did some part of the interviews. I found different
question. I think it's important. Like, what is the question? Just formulate the question. What are you trying to explain? Because I think that maybe part of your difficulties is that the question is not clear in your head yet. Because you're telling me you're defining your question in terms of your observations, unless I misunderstood you. I think it's always easy to think of your analysis in terms of an outcome that you want to explain. Okay, and what is this outcome? Are career choices, or succession strategies, or something, some choice they make, for instance. Now, what you do then, for instance, one of the things you could do, you create a table when in one column, for each row, you will have one row for each of these entrepreneurs. How many entrepreneurs are you studying?
By far now I made just 20 entrepreneurs because
20. You will have 20 rows. In each row, you will have one entrepreneur. For each entrepreneur, you will specify this particular choice that they made or whatever it is that you want to explain. And then you will have other columns where you track the industry background or whatever else seems to be relevant intuitively to explain these choices. And then you will group them by choice. And then you can even use shades of gray to visually distinguish the various groups in terms of the choices. And then you can see if there are some patterns in terms of certain backgrounds being more frequently associated with certain choices. This is an example of using a table to highlight some patterns in your data. But I think it's important to have a clear research question that drives the selection of what goes in the data.
Okay, everything is clear. Thank you so much. Yeah, very useful for me now. Yeah.
Good luck. I hope it
Thank you. Yeah, thank you.
Aurélie.
Thank you for a very insightful talk and discussion. I have a question regarding what you said about being intellectually honest and not concealing evidence and maybe looking for deliberately showing forces and having like really having a more how those forces may maybe challenge the interpretation that we have. I have a kind of odd question because I mean, it actually mostly reflects my experience that sometimes when you collect maybe interview, you have a bunch of 50 interviews or maybe 50 interviews or so. And then there will be some interviewees that maybe have more bold statement about the phenomenon that maybe you're trying to understand. And then maybe half of the respondent will be maybe mumbling and not saying really much about what the thing that you think might be interesting. I'm just wondering that when you analyze the data, and sometimes it shows in the analysis, I find myself using maybe a bunch of 10 interviews where I have 40 others that I do not necessarily use. So I'm wondering if it's intellectually honest to more or less write the story that somehow reflects mostly what maybe 1/3 of the respondents say.
That's absolutely normal, and for many good reasons. So first of all, informants are different. Some are very eloquent, are very articulate. Some informants are marvelous. So you ask them questions and they elaborate and they talk for hours. And others, you really have to pull answers out of them, and they're more and so there's that. And also, it is absolutely normal that your interview protocol, the questions you ask and also the probes will change over time, because you hear something unexpected from an informant, and then from then on, you ask different questions. But of course, then you have maybe 15 interviews that didn't touch that issue because it didn't seem to be important. And you cannot necessarily go back and discuss with all of them. Sometimes you do. Sometimes you don't have that possibility. So I think it's fine that there's no expectation for your statements to be backed up by all your informants. I think what is important is that it's backed up by a sufficient number of informants, knowledgeable informants. They are not contradicted by other evidence, and there is ideally, possibly also some robust support from archival sources, observations. So that's why, for instance, if I'm coding and I realize that in one of my tables there are some codes that may be very interesting, but there's just one person, and there are repeated quotes, but always from the same person or two persons, I have a problem. Now, I'm not comfortable going ahead with that unless I find some archival evidence that corroborates that, or sometimes I may use the second round of review to go back to some of the informants and say, well, I heard some of your colleagues mention this. It seemed very interesting, and we didn't talk about it. So, what is your view on that? Really, grounded theory is based on iteration between data collection, analysis, back and forth until you're comfortable with having robust support for these emerging theoretical propositions, interpretations. So. Jonathan.
Yes, thank you very much. So 2 questions, one relatively quick, and that is, I know when you have developed a quantitative database, oftentimes researchers will use the database for more than one study. And I was wondering, first off, in more of the singular case study perspective, if you're able to do that? Or do you spend 8, 10, 15 years for one study or one paper? And then the second question is, I understand with grounded theory, you typically go into the process with a blank slate, if you will, and let the theory kind of emerge from the bottom up, from what the data and the information that you're gathering tells you. But for a case study analysis, are you taking the same approach, or do you go into the study with maybe a general direction or perspective that you kind of want to head? So,
question number one, I think it's absolutely normal and not normal perhaps, but absolutely okay to use your qualitative database for more than one paper, as long as there's no overlap, and the overlap is minimal, and there's no contradictions between the two. Sometimes you gather these very rich databases, and you can possibly look at it from different angles. The robotic surgery study, my colleagues Valentina and Amelia, they then used those data to write a paper about the public funding of innovation, using more the interviews with the policymakers, politicians, local administrators that were in the database, but we didn't use much for to explain the diffusion of robotic surgery. That's just one example. I have published a few papers. Say I've done a few cases where then I got 2 or 3 papers out of it. But then I also did cases where I worked a lot, and all I got was 1 paper. That's it. You move on, and because that's it. You don't see opportunities to get anything else out of it, and it's okay. Second question was about tabula rasa, empty slate. First of all, I don't believe in this. Like, not that I don't believe in that. Yes, you should go into the field with no preconception about the explanation, but you don't go completely empty-headed. As I said, your theoretical explanations built on some theoretical foundations. You need to have those theoretical foundations. And then you will build your grounded, emerging theory on those theoretical foundations. But you have to be, you have to have no prejudices or no preconceptions about what explains the phenomenon. Your research question shouldn't have a preconceived answer. That I think is important. And I think the same goes with case studies. The difference is that with case studies, sometimes you do have some constructs, some variables that you want, some outcome that you want to explain. And therefore, that may drive some data analysis, some theory-driven coding. While grounded theory is really open, usually, most of the times, entirely open. And then there's a connection later with the theory. Sometimes in case studies, you start with a construct that's already part of the research question, and you want to understand how that changes, or you want to see explain that, and that will drive the initial data analysis. You provide evidence of this thing changing or this thing varying, and then from that you reconstruct an understanding of why that happened.
Okay. Thank you very much, and thank you for not only your presentation, but your patience and feedback for all of us.
It's a pleasure. It's a pleasure. And I still have an hour and a half before I have to start cooking. Dolores.
Thank you for the second question. So I have a case study I approached ethnographically, and my reviewers at MJ told me that I did not analyze my data ethnographically. So after you talk, I start imagining a table where I can use to explain, like in columns, my observations,
yes,
and the interviewees' responses. Because I have in the text of my paper, I use both data, but not organically, I think. So maybe I'm struggling if using the data at the same level, my own experience and the interviewees' responses may be read as ethnographically. I don't know.
Yes,
if I explain.
so I'm not an ethnographer, so again, I'm very careful about a method that I don't master. My understanding is it's very it's kind of tricky to document your ethnographic observations. A lot has to do with the style of writing, the persuasiveness of the writing. Like the best ethnographers are also always fabulous writers. John Van Man and Stephen Barley, these guys write so well. So there's a lot of that in persuading your readers and your reviewers about the soundness of your conclusions. But yes, I absolutely think that using tables, there's a lot of ethnographic studies, published papers based on ethnographic studies that use tables to show evidence of the excerpts from your field notes and how they are consistent with certain observed patterns and certain excerpts from interviews. I think that Hargadon and Sutton, the paper that I mentioned, I gave an example of the triangulation table, that was pretty much an ethnographic study, or sort of, if I remember right. So yeah, sure, if that would be worth trying. Joyce. Then I know that there's probably discussion going on in the chat, but I can only follow one thing at a time. My brain is limited that way. So I apologize if I'm prioritizing those that raise their hands. And maybe Ibrat, if there's anything relevant going on in the chat, you can bring it to the discussion.
I think most people who post the questions in the chat, they subsequently ask the question directly.
So, Joyce, please. You're muted. You're muted. Joyce, you are muted. We cannot hear you.
I'm so sorry.
No problem. I was trying to. You muted. You muted.
Yes, I was saying thank you so much for your great presentation. I'm going into my third year entrepreneurship major at Oklahoma State University in US. And last semester I was enrolled in a qualitative class, and listening to you throughout this presentation has made so many things be clear and made more practical.
Thank you.
Okay, so as an entrepreneurship, PhD student, it seems like it's very hard to publish a qualitative paper. Is it like we're just young in the field and I don't know if the assumption is we don't know so much, so we need to work with scholars like you who have published papers and maybe they find our work reputable, or is it like we have weak theory? That's one part. Then the second part is, okay, when you say it's a single case, that can be special because this case is unique. But how many is too many? Like if I have 15, 5 or 10, like when does it seem like my findings are legitimate? I mean, like if I'm going for many cases, not just one special case, and I'm choosing to take 5 or 10, which number is a bit realistic for my theory to be grounded?
Okay, so first question, yes, some academic areas are more receptive to qualitative research than others, and that's because of the the background of people, and there are some areas where most people are trained in quantitative work and they just don't know how to handle qualitative work, or they think it's rubbish anyway, and that's a fact. So I think it's important to be aware of the methodological preferences of the community that you're trying to join. Organizational theorists are very welcoming. In strategy, there is a subset of strategy scholars, strategist practice, that certainly prefer qualitative work, and it's more difficult to publish qualitative work in the more mainstream strategy area. Entrepreneurship is probably one of those fields where the background of most scholars is quantitative. But I think that in JBV, Journal Business Venturing should be perhaps the most receptive entrepreneurship journal, most receptive to qualitative research. And now there's more and more organizational theorists that look at entrepreneurship from the perspective of institutional theory or other theories and do qualitative work on entrepreneurship. So I think it's a matter of finding the right audience and making sure that your paper ends up in the hands of people that are receptive to the particular method that you adopt. Second question was, how many cases do I need? Well, paradoxically, in my experience, it's much easier to get a single case study published than a multiple case study. It's a single case study. It's a single case study. So as long as you select it properly, you present it as an extreme case or an ideal case, you go in depth, and as long as it's an interesting case study and you do your job well, people will not question the selection of the case. The problem with multiple case studies is that people will go like, why 4 and not 6? And why these 4? How did you select these 4 in the first place? And it's legitimate. It's a legitimate questions. Like they want to make sure that you didn't just search for, I don't know, 12, 15, 20, and then you selected those that somehow fit your theory. So that's why when doing multiple case studies, either you do it the Eisenhardt's way. So she selects polar cases, and she's very clear that she starts with, I don't know, 10, 12, 20 firms, organizations, and then she looks at a particular variable that she wants to explain, like in the classic case, speed of decision making, and then she says, I'm taking the fastest and the slowest. I remove things in between, and I compare these two, because the idea is that comparing the fastest and the slowest should help you understand what drives speed in the first place. Okay, then the sampling is clear, and that's a very solid, strong template, but we don't always try to do this. So if you're trying to use multiple case studies to have a more robust support for a theory, then there's a problem, because why 2, why 3, why 4? You need to explain the sampling so that it's clear that it wasn't random, but it wasn't too manipulated at the same time. No? You want to reassure them that transparently you came up with those cases, and those cases are, I don't know, it's a non-biased representation of the phenomenon in its natural manifestations.
I think you've answered what I'm really interested in. Like, I have this special case that I want to write about, but I needed to know that one can actually be good enough.
So I think that the problem with single cases is that it shouldn't be unique. Because if it's unique, if it's too unusual, if it's like too particular, then the question is like, but what is this a case of? What can I learn from this if it's so special, if it's so unique? And sometimes, yes, even from unique cases, you can learn a lot, but then you have to clearly explain.
Yeah.
You can certainly use unique cases to challenge existing theories. Say, well, you know, we assume this, but here's a case that contradicts that. And this reveals something important about the theory we have. Or you can use a case to discover, say, look, this stuff was never accessible before. This is unique, but it gives us unique insight into something that we couldn't really, we couldn't study before, and therefore it is important. It's a revelatory case.
Thank you.
I hope it helps. Angelo.
Hello, Davide, and thank you very much for your presentation. It was very, very interesting. I do have a question about theoretical foundations for your study. so sometimes you have to defend your theoretical choices.
Yes.
Like, and sometimes you find some reviewers that's not very familiar with the theory that you're using. So that usually make it skeptical about the work. And so I experienced some troubles in trying to say the right word in order to defend why I did pick like structuration theory. And sometimes it happens that some theories get more fashionable, so they're very used at a certain point in time, and then they got not very used. So, but then I also think that an author should have the right to decide what type of theory to use for his studies, as long as you think that is consistent and is powerful and has a heuristic power. So I'd like to hear what you think about this.
I think that the question is, are you using this theory as an analytical lens, or are you using this theory as, this is the theory I want to contribute to? Because these are two different issues. So you certainly have the right, both, okay? When it comes to choosing the theory you want to contribute to, then that by necessity shapes your publishing opportunities, in a sense that publishing is like joining a conversation. You want to join a community of scholars that are interested in certain things and contribute to the conversation. Now, if you're interested in adding to structuration theory, you have to find a journal where people are interested in that, where people publish on that, where that debate is going on. Because if you send something that says, I want to contribute to structuration theory, to a journal where nobody is interested in that, nobody subscribed to that, it's like, of course they will reject it and say, I'm sorry, the conversation you're trying to join is taking place elsewhere. You certainly have a right to choose the theory that you want to adopt. You don't have the right to choose the journal that will publish it. Okay?
Right. That's right.
Yeah.
Makes sense.
And sorry, when it comes to the theoretical angle, so say I'm interested in explaining this phenomenon and I'm using structuration theory to explain it, then first of all, you have to choose a journal where people are interested in that phenomenon too, same as before. And then you will have to defend this theory and say, I believe that this theory is particularly useful to explain this phenomenon because, and you will have to explain. Now, what is the added value? Now, we have always explained this phenomenon in economic terms, and but you have to problematize this and say, well, actually, doing this has left us with some unanswered questions. And I'm choosing to look at it from a structuration perspective because it may illuminate that. So you have to explain, you have to argue, you have to persuade your reviewers that there's a good reason why you're doing what you're doing, and you're doing something that wouldn't be the first choice for those that are reviewing.
Thank you, Davide.
No problem. It's been almost 3 hours. I mean, you deserve a gold medal for having been here for almost 3 hours.